about terrestrial carbon and carbon offsets. I'm going to talk a little bit about agriculture and forestry. Given that I've only got about 15 minutes, that's not very much time. I started my career wanting to be an agricultural economist, working a little bit in forestry, given my background training, and I ended up being dragged into carbon. I think everyone was being dragged into carbon in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And one of the things that disappointed me the most was we'd come to an agreement at Kyoto, and that was followed up by the Marrakesh Agreement, in which case forest carbon became a big issue. And the Canadian government at one point wanted to meet its Kyoto target through using carbon offset credits from forestry to meet about 40%, slightly less of its target. And it was well underway. And then suddenly what hit was the mountain pine beetle. And the Canadian forest, instead of being a net carbon sink, ended up being a net carbon source. So that kind of kiboshed things a little bit. I'm trying to move here we go. So I tried to figure out, why I was against this particular Marrakesh Accord. Well, part of it was because all of the carbon that they were talking about was kind of made up. All right, Canada was just given 12 megatons of carbon that they could remove, or carbon dioxide then, that they could remove just willy-nilly because of something they had done prior to 1990. And there were other countries like that as well. And when we look at net zero, one of the problems we have is that there will be some emissions. We don't know how many, but currently the methods for capturing those emissions are to use bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is commonly referred to as BECCS. The other one is these forest carbon offsets, mainly in the form of carbon dioxide removals. And basically by planting trees where none exist today, which is going to be a little difficult because some of the areas they're talking about are totally incapable of growing trees at this point. Now, I'm not against terrestrial carbon sinks. All right, I'm against their use as carbon offsets. I think deforestation does result in CO2 entering the atmosphere, and it can be pretty bad. And we want to prevent deforestation. Do we want to give carbon offset credits? Maybe, but I don't think so, because my biggest concern relates to corruption. All right, and I'll expand on that a little later on. I also think that planting trees is a good idea for reasons other than just carbon. But again, if you make that your way of achieving targets, then you get a problem. All right, and it's not just corruption, but it's a problem of measuring and determining how much carbon dioxide you're really removing at any given time. And of course, you can convert agricultural land to permanent pasture to store carbon. You can do things like reduce fertilizer use, lower cow, beef herds, and so on. All right, all of those are good things. We're not against that. The problem is this whole business of measuring things. So therefore, I conclude that terrestrial carbon fluxes shouldn't be considered in accounting emission reduction targets. One thing is food is too important. It's open to corruption. Counting emissions from activities that prevent greenhouse gas emissions are particularly problematic. And I sometimes think that in this whole area I'm working in, countries are less interested in preventing climate change, but more interested in virtue signaling. So in other words, we've done our part. And then we come, of course, to something that's going to come up a little bit later in this talk, and that's the press notice that went out with Working Group 1, and it was argued that this was a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening, and evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. Well, the implication of it is that if we are at an immediate risk, terrestrial carbon sequestration is just too late. We shouldn't even be doing it, and I probably shouldn't even talk anymore. So what are carbon offsets? They're a reduction in CO2 emissions or an equivalent removal of CO2 from the atmosphere that is realized outside of a compliance market and can be used to counterbalance greenhouse gas emissions from a capped entity. And we sometimes refer to this simply as CDRs or capped carbon dioxide removals. Now, here's how economists look at this. So if you think of a diagram that where you have a positive in both directions here, okay, and this is your target. Emission reductions target is OE. That's how much you want to emit. And this is going to be the cost of emitting that. The supply curve, if you like, for emitting it, or the cost of the marginal cost of CO2 abatement. And then anything left from A to P, so P becomes your price, but then you have a derived demand for these offsets, which is basically the difference between these. All right. So what you get is that the abatement curve, or the derived demand for our carbon offsets in the carbon offset market is also, you have a marginal cost curve for that. And where they intersect is how many carbon offsets society will want to bring, given by C star. It lowers the price to P star. And as a result, the actual emissions reduction that occurs in the compliance market is given by 0 E star. So these carbon offsets, they reduce the emitter's costs of complying with emission reduction targets. They buy time to develop and adopt emission reducing technologies. And that's been an argument that's been ongoing since Marrakesh. And their problem is that they reduce incentives to invest in such technologies because the price is lower. And they increase uncertainty and, as a result, corruption. Now, I think everyone is pretty well familiar with the problems of offsets. I quickly talk about them here. Additionality is the criterion that dictates that an emission source can only obtain carbon offsets for emission reductions above and beyond what would normally occur. And I've encountered many cases where a landowner would come to me and say, well, I planted trees and I think I should get carbon credits for it. And I'm going, well, did you plant those regardless of having the credits? Well, yeah, but now I want money for it. And that's no longer additionality. Then there's leakage, and I'm going to show a case of leakage shortly. That's where you do something in one area and you increase emissions elsewhere, despite the fact that you reduce them in one place. And estimates of leakages have been as high as 100%, or even in some cases more, because it encourages development of something that creates emissions. And then there's the issue of double dipping, where a country invests in another country and gets credits for it, but the country that they invest in also claims the credit reduction. And then we have a problem with all these different instruments that we have, of which most of them are carbon offsets. So you can reduce domestic CO2 emissions, but you can avoid that through all these, for example, certified emission reduction credits and so on and so forth. The thing I'm going to talk a bit more about at length is the length of time that an activity is used to mitigate climate change. How long does it keep CO2 out of the atmosphere? And the other thing, of course, is these costs of measuring, monitoring, enforcing, and negotiating trades and the means by which trades are made, which turns out to be, in the parlance of economics, a principal agent problem, where the agent has information that the principal doesn't have, and the agent acts contrary to what the principal wants. In this case, the principal wants CO2 reduction, but the agent doesn't give the amount of CO2 reduction that the principal thinks that they're going to get. So let's first look at agriculture. All right. So what we want to do in agriculture is reduce the cultivated area. All right. And we want to plant trees on marginal agricultural lands or convert them to grasslands. We want to reduce cow herds, in other words, less milk. Beef production we want to reduce, and that reduces methane emissions, which are a powerful greenhouse gas. The problem is this applies to ruminants such as sheep, goats, deer, bison, elk, etc., and even giraffes. And what we find in British Columbia, for example, is that where we graze cattle on overcut forest land, we find that that increases the elk and deer herds. So what you're doing is if you have less cows, for example, grazing, or less cattle rather, and you'll get more deer. So there's a trade-off right there. You get some leakage, reduce fertilizer use, and no tillage agriculture to enhance soil carbon. Now we've shown that that might not be the case, that if you go with the zero tillage, you might not really reduce soil carbon because the plowing actually pushes the top matter that has been the residue down deep underneath the soil. Now, if we look at examples, Sri Lanka got into trouble when they reduced fertilizer use and required farmers to not have zero fertilizer, basically. And it led to higher food prices and starvation, and to the point where the government was overthrown. In Canada, the Trudeau government wants to reduce fertilizer use by 30% to avoid these N2O emissions. And in fact, climate police have been illegally they've been going on to private lands in Saskatchewan to measure nitrate levels in order to form a baseline. And we're also investing in grasslands and wetlands and that kind of thing. But the result will be a reduction in grain production. I've been following the Dutch situation as well, where the government wants to reduce the sector by some 40%. But despite its small size, the Netherlands is the second largest exporter of food and agricultural commodities in the world after the US. And some people find that strange, and they say, oh, it's all this, these minor things that are very valuable. But it turns out they're big players in barley and in oats and a bunch of other stuff that's grown on land in Saskatchewan and areas like that. And the result in the Netherlands has been the formation of a new party called the Farmer Citizens Movement, or the Dutch acronym would be the BBB. And it became a major player in the last election, winning more seats than any other party. So you got a new party with 0 seats, and suddenly they're the major player in the country. Now we can show what the impact is using abductive reasoning, which is what economists are most famous for. So I'm not asking you to understand this, and I could provide you with more understanding of this diagram. But basically what you've got is a situation where you reduce the supply of the Netherlands in milk, say, or in Canada in terms of wheat. And that affects the world market, which is shown by these excess supply curves. So the excess supply curve shifts to the left, the price increases, and as a result, you slide up the supply curve of the rest of the world, and you get a rebound effect in the rest of the world given by this distance here that I'm marking off, whether it's dairy or wheat. So you've got a reduction here, and you've got an increase here, and it's an empirical question as to what extent this rebound overcomes this reduction. So it's not necessarily a case that whatever the Dutch do in reducing N2O, in reducing nitrogen fertilizer, or Canada for that matter, that you're going to get any results globally. So the global price of food goes up. Greenhouse gas reductions in the Netherlands or Canada are offset in the rest of the world. And interestingly, farmers then lobby to obtain these ephemeral carbon offset credits for planting crops, reducing tillage operations, etc. And this is when I make this case that basically countries who are doing this are virtue signaling, because the leakage can even be as large as the benefits from that. Now, when we come to forestry and carbon offsets, there have been that whole area has been plagued with measurement problems, and these have led to corruption. For example, we've determined arbitrary cutoffs for determining carbon uptake. So in other words, you take into account all the carbon that is sequestered in a forest ecosystem for the next 50 years. And after 50 years, suddenly the carbon isn't counted anymore. And what could happen is that in year 51, the site gets harvested and all the carbon goes back into the atmosphere. In order to meet these Kyoto targets, we've identified a temporary certified emission reduction, which is basically an annual rental of forest sequestration, and a long-term, but it's not a permanent reduction, and that's a 5-year one, and it works something like this. So here's a growth function for a forest ecosystem. This indicates harvest and then growth for the next rotation. And at time T1, say 10 years into the growth of this forest, we identify that this amount of carbon has been sequestered in the system. And for the next 5 years, a company that needs to reduce its emissions of greenhouse gases purchases this amount of carbon reduction. All right, this certified emission reduction. It does it so every year. Anybody can buy them. Each year, this amount becomes available. Now, the forest, of course, is growing, but it's this amount because of the monitoring. So then we monitor again 5 years from now, and now this amount is available. TCER2 is available for annual sale as a temporary carbon offset. Or you can have long-term certified emission reduction given by this difference between TCER2 and TCER1. But it's still not a permanent one, but it was a 5-year one for simply to address the issues related to the carbon, to the Kyoto Protocol. Now, what affects the measurement of carbon offsets or the carbon dioxide removals? Well, the weighting of physical carbon dioxide as to when the carbon flux occurs. So in other words, what we're arguing, and biologists have been doing that, they've been identifying what's called a present ton equivalent of carbon. They recognize that if you grow a tree 10 years from now, that's not the same as the same growth that's occurring today. Because if we have an urgent problem in addressing climate change, then carbon that's taken out of the atmosphere 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now is worth a lot less today in reducing climate change, in mitigating climate change, than it would if it were done today. So this is an important policy variable. It recognizes the urgency with which we need to address climate change. We also have to look at decay of post-harvest wood products, and some people don't even look at post-harvest wood products. All right, but those are very important. There are other factors, of course, that go into this, and types and variety of tree species, genetically modified species, for example, location and quality of the forest land, and how it's managed, whether or not you do silvicultural operations, whether you fertilize down the road or whatever. So one cannot ignore the impact of harvests. All right, if you don't harvest, you conserve. And there was an argument made back in the 1970s, I think, in Science or Nature, that said we're best off to store the carbon, keep it in the forest and not cut the trees, but they ignored any carbon that went into product pools. So we can store carbon in products, and then we can also argue that wood substitutes for concrete and steel in construction, and we can even count emissions avoided because these materials are not produced. I'm a bit skeptical about doing that, but let's not get there at this time. Or we can use the biomass for fuel. What's that?
I was going to ask if you could wrap things up with this slide.
Okay, I just want to show that the urgency issue. For example, here we generate electricity with this amount of CO2 being taken out of the atmosphere by, say, coal. And if we use wood, it takes this amount out, all right? And we get a carbon debt that is reduced over time as the trees grow. And basically, and this will be my last slide then, if there's no urgency, then eventually we will have a time period, maybe 80 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, where the new growth has taken the CO2 from wood burning out of the atmosphere again. But if we put a timer on this, if we discount future carbon and there's great urgency to deal with climate change, then maybe the thing is going to look more like this, and then we don't even get rid of the debt due to the fossil fuel. In other words, wood burning is worse off than burning coal or natural gas or something like that. Okay, I have more slides, but time's up.
All right, thank you so much.